Hello, cheeky natives. This is your boy Lekahonolo flying solo. Dr. Slay is out there saving lives, so I have to be the one to hold down the fort. But we really are going to have a really interesting conversation today. I think what's important is also the political moment in which we find ourselves, right? We've been speaking a lot about violence in this country and particular types of violence. And I think our guest today really wrote a very thought-provoking but also vulnerable and insightful account, right? I think that sometimes we underestimate how much the retelling of a particular story happens, right? So I'm going to be talking to the author of Yellow and Confused, born in Taiwan, raised in South Africa, and making sense of it all. I just want to read the blurb or just a little bit about what's going on so that you have an idea of what the conversation is that we'll be having. Ming Lin's family migrated from Taiwan to South Africa when she was 3 years old. Growing up in the 90s in a largely Afrikaans Bloemfontein within a small East Asian community, she was always the outsider, too yellow for the whites, but not Asian enough. When she didn't conform to the rules of her first-generation Asian elders. Taiwanese or South African, good girl or rebel, creative or disappointment. Ming Cheau, widely known for her passion for Taiwanese home cooking and popular cookbook Just Add Rice, shares her personal journey as she tries to understand and rise above the hurdles she has experienced. Yellow and Confused provides a colorful and engaging look into authentic and uniquely South African life. Hi Ming.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Me. I'm excited. This is going to be a great conversation.
Before we start, we normally just give our listeners,
Yes.
a little bit of a taster about what's in store for them. Can you just read this for us?
Of course, definitely. Ming Cheau is here. Roaring laughter erupts from a sea of non-Asians. The yellow peril has arrived. Our Asian persuasion. I never truly saw my skin tone as yellow. It looked more white than yellow. My parents told me I was born even-toned milky white with a mop of hair that stood up like fireworks. In our home languages, we talk about our own skin tones as white. The elders would remark how beautiful we were with our white skin and warn us to stay out of the sun so our skin didn't turn black. This is based on a direct translation to English. In Mandarin, these words don't have those direct definitions and connotations.
Thank you so much, Ming. So, let's start with your first book, right? So you wrote a cookbook, Just
Yes.
Add Rice. You speak a little bit about it, but I wanted to speak about why was it important for you to do this Taiwanese cookbook?
For me, I didn't actually. The goal wasn't to write a cookbook. I have a food blog, Butterfingers.koza, and I used to share recipes to basically preserve the kind of dishes that my parents had taught me growing up and the things that I enjoyed from my culture. And sadly, when we speak about lack of representation, it's on the table as well. And so we don't necessarily see ourselves. And when I started studying in Cape Town, I'd moved away from home, and not having the representation around me or the consistent denominator of having a community and a family to cook with me, to eat with me, I realized how I became slowly assimilated to the Western world of food, instead of enjoying and continuing cooking the stuff that my parents raised me with. And I love the flavors from home. I love the dishes from home because it's not only nostalgia, but it created that sense of comfort, that sense of security, being who I was in Cape Town and almost feeling isolated from everyone else. So the cookbook was someone came to me and asked me if I was interested in doing a cookbook and that they would love to publish it.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, cool, let's make this happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that my whole community, and it wasn't just me that felt this way, but my whole community needed something like this, because we are here, even though we are a minority in South Africa, we've played part and parcel of the population from, even when we talk about the Chinese locals having been here from the 1600s. And yet we are still not represented. They are not represented on a plate. We lost a lot of our culture moving along the way, and I think that in order to just preserving this and the stories that come with the culture, because Chinese culture dates back to over 5,000 years old. There's a lot of rich history in there, and I think to lose it all is such a sad, it's such a loss, because how do you learn about your heritage? How do you know about your origins? Because if you don't know about these things, how do you move forward in society?
So it's really interesting. When I read your book, I was really I think, uncomfortable
Yeah.
by the term yellow.
Yes.
And I wanted us to speak a little bit about that, right? So we understand that in the context of the United States, yellow people became yellow by the law, right? So they were like these mixtures of people. But I suppose then the language is also adopted here, like you're saying, not white enough, but also not Asian enough. And I wanted to know, why was it that you decided to say yellow and confused? Why was that the title of the book?
So for me, in terms of privilege and understanding my space as a light-skinned Asian in South Africa, I felt it was important to differentiate light-skinned Asians to South Asians. And I feel that it does play a major role in differentiating who we are. Because when we talk about Asia, there's like 48 countries. It's not exactly you can't really say Asian and encompass one race. Yet when people talk about Asian, they really do mean light-skinned, Asians, Chinese or Japanese. And usually those are the only two that are referred to. And in the context of South Africa, it's usually Chinese. So even within the space of yellow, no one truly understands the element of race when it comes to light-skinned Asians. When I speak about this in my book as well, where on government forms there's the box for white, there's the box for black, then there's coloured. So sometimes we're told to tick coloured, but
and
then
sometimes other,
and sometimes
literal
literally
othering.
Yes, exactly. And so for me, the fact that Indian gets a tick box, but then there's Asian as well, for the rest of us, it also goes back to how nothing actually fucking makes sense in South Africa. So for me, yellow was it really encompassed the whole concept of, when I talk about privilege, when I talk about discrimination and the racism that we experience, that it is isolated, as in the Asian scheme of things. It is different. And therefore, I kind of think it was important to keep that within the book, especially because everything that South Africa learns about Chinese culture, Japanese culture, yellow people cultures, is from American or Western media. And unfortunately, a lot of the stereotypes, everything comes out of that. And it has become part of casual conversation, casual racism. The microaggressions occur on a regular basis. Literally, on a flight on the way here, 2 kids in front of me were playing Ching Chong Cha. And for me, Ching Chong Cha is racist onomatopoeia because it means fuck all to us. Ching Chong isn't actual words. Ching Chong has only ever been used towards me in a derogatory way. Therefore, how could this be a fun game?
You do something really incredible in your book, which is to elevate the idea of privilege, because often when we speak about minorities, wherever we may find ourselves, we tag them a lot with not privilege. But in your book, you constantly, like, it's a really prevalent theme in the book, where you speak about privilege and you speak about like how the closer proximity to whiteness meant that you were treated differently from other people, but also at the same time there was certain racism that occurred. And I wanted us to speak about the idea of like privilege, right? Why was it important for you to elevate that and to bring that out in the book?
I feel that especially from a lightness perspective, we're so difficult with ourselves to acknowledge what privilege is and that we do have privilege. And there's many different layers of privilege within the different scheme of things. So every single group, there is different levels of privilege. And so I felt that if I could be comfortable and vulnerable enough to talk about my privilege and to talk about the unlearning that I had to do in order to acknowledge this privilege, maybe a lot more people would be comfortable with that as well.
I mean, even with the unlearning, what I really enjoyed is with the unlearning, you weren't like, oh, I knew this for myself and I made it. You were like, there were people in my life who came. So you also speak about the idea of sisterhood and a friendship, and like there were these people in your life who came, and they are the ones who were like, Ming, actually when you do this is what it translates to. Do you want to talk about the idea of like friendship and how friendship has aided you in the journey of unlearning?
It actually has been so incredible, and I have to give props to black women because just for me to be embraced in that kind of space, to show, well, I didn't really want to have to prove myself to them as an ally. I like to do things on the quiet. I like to be behind the scenes. If people need help, I will actively help you, but in the background. I never want to take your light from you. But the problem is, because I am not black, I am not the most discriminated against race in South Africa. I need to realize that also when I'm in those spaces and how much I've assimilated to whiteness and the problematic behavior that I exhibit. And I don't want to be that friend that you just slowly lose on the side because you don't actually want to address their problematic behavior. The first time I was addressed, I was honestly shocked. I didn't know how to deal with it. And I almost became slightly defensive around that. But then I was told as well, in a very gentle way, that being defensive is not the point. It's about just acknowledging it. You don't even need to apologize. It really is about you doing better the next time around. And if you remove yourself from that situation, you completely stop yourself from even learning or understanding what this context actually is. So I forced myself to be uncomfortable, and I learned the lessons that came with it. And I really also would like to help others in that kind of position to be able to understand that it's okay to learn these lessons. It's okay to make mistakes. We're not perfect.
Yeah.
We have all been conditioned so heavily by media, by colonization, by apartheid, that how can we truly say that we know everything, that we don't need to unlearn anymore, especially as privileged people in South Africa.
So, I mean, let's start at the beginning.
Yes.
So, you're 3. Your parents migrate to South Africa, at Dorpy in the Vrystaat. Bloemfontein,
Yes.
right? Tell me about that.
That was a very interesting experience, so to say. So my parents, being full-grown adults in Taiwan before actually coming over to South Africa, they've never experienced racism. They have never experienced the kind of, trauma that we would face as children in a space like this. So they couldn't truly prepare us for the political climate that we were about to enter. And so going to school and being thoroughly confused as to why suddenly people were telling me I was eating dogs and praying to a statue and all these things that, I've never eaten a dog in my life, and even if I did, there's a historical and political reason why small villages in Korea and actually in China actually do, and it's such a sad history as well that it's really not something to mock about. So it was very confusing for me to see people come children especially come past me and pull their eyes slanted backwards to pretend to look like me, or use nasal pitch noises and pretend to speak an idea of what they thought was Chinese to me.
Asian.
Asian. No, I'm speaking Asian. And it's like, yeah, sure. And all of that I think had really contributed to a lot of my problems with my mental health, and to actually understand why do I feel discomfort, why do I feel depressed, why do I feel anxiety, and why am I so angry? And none of it was really addressed as a child. And so this only truly happened as an adult after college, where I started working and I realized that I was the only person of color in my teams that I'd ever worked in the agencies that I used to work at, because I used to be in advertising. And I realized that I was either the only woman of color or the only person of color, or and it's just astounding to me how a country with a black majority is not included in media campaigns that are for them. And it baffled me so much that I couldn't understand the lack of representation. And so going back to being a child with this lack of representation and not understanding that is the problem itself, that the system is the problem, and thinking that, I actually just need to be more like them to be accepted, to be welcomed in the spaces, because I am the problem.
Tell us about, is it Sally? So the idea that you had come out of town, you had known your name to be a particular name, and this is how Sandy. Yes, you had known your name to be Ming.
Yes.
And you are told you suddenly have to change it. And you know what's interesting for me is that when I was studying in the US, we had a lot of people from China, from Japan, come to study in the US.
Yes.
And they had to change their names, and it's like they already tell them, as you're entering into this space, this is what you need to do.
Yes.
And I want to speak about a little bit about that, how, for you as a child, because you were a child, how did that feel in that moment?
Well, the thing is, I don't actually remember the actual time in which it happened. So it was just, by the way, you're also Sandy. And Sandy was only ever used by peers, so people at school, and outside of home spaces. At home, I was Cheau, which is second sister, and I was Cheau, which is my parents' pet name for me. So it also didn't make really too much sense. So I had all these names, so many names, and I could never connect to the one that was used on a regular basis, which was Sandy. So while my sister and my brother both had thoughtful names chosen for them, my parents were kind of in a rut with me because they kind of just flipping through a baby book and were like, okay, cool, this is fine. So there was no real intention behind the name. There was no real reason for the name. So I decided as I got older to reclaim something that was that is part of my identity that I had to suppress, because we were told as a family that having English names would make us more
easier, more likable, more palatable.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because I think there's also a lot of reclaiming that has happened in your life.
Yes.
The one reclaiming is of your name, to be like, well, screw these people, like this is who I am and this is what I'm going to do. But also reclaiming in the sense that when you wrote Just at Rise, it was also a reclamation of culture. It was like, here we're told about a particular food, we eat dogs, whatever. But you're reclaiming to be like, actually, the food that we eat, I enjoy, and I want you to talk to us about that reclamation. Like, how did it feel for you to, after so many years of being like pushed to the margins, there came a moment where you were like, actually, I'm amazing. My culture is amazing, and I want to walk knowing that I'm Taiwanese.
Yes. So being Taiwanese, we are slightly patriotic of our own country. And so my parents obviously had this belief in them and to always teach us to be proudly Taiwanese. So at home, we were taught to be proudly Taiwanese. But outside of home, we had to assimilate, basically, to survive. And the problem with that is I never understood how to be proud of myself and of my culture. And I think that it's more understanding that as an adult, I've been validated and with regards to my culture, my name, and the way I am as an immigrant in South Africa, that validation alone has allowed me to actually reclaim all of these things, because I honestly would not have been able to do it by myself. And so the unlearning journey is continuous for me. I will never claim to be woke, and I will never claim to be highly progressive, that you should come to me to talk to me about these kind of things. I will admit that I have had racist conditioning. I will admit that I have a lot of privilege, and that sometimes I'm not even aware of these privileges. But I'm comfortable in saying that when I know about it, I will actively do my best to unlearn that.
I want you to talk about the relationships of women in your life. You have a different relationship to your sister than that of your mother.
Yes.
And I want you to talk to us about, like, because your mom, as you said, was an adult when she moved to South Africa.
Yes.
So moved to South Africa with a particular idea of Taiwan and just came here. And your sister is of a lesser generation, which you have a better sort of relationship with. Tell us about that.
It was very interesting, actually, after dissecting all of it. And I realized that my mother, well, actually, all parents from the first generation as immigrants, when they come over to South Africa, they carry the mentality of the period of time it was in Taiwan over. Whereas the people who are still living in Taiwan, their mentalities progress as the country progresses. But unfortunately, they would not progress with that. So a lot of the ideas of first generation immigrants, the elders, are very old school, are very patriarchal, are very problematic. And I think that my mother honestly didn't know what was better other than to make sure that we were safe and to not stand out. To her meant security. To not be bullied meant security. And so it became almost this self-perpetuated problem where I never felt good enough with my parents. I never felt like I could live up to their standards, because myself as an individual, I am more of a creative. And
there's also this notion of like the model immigrant, particularly when we think about like the Asian community as a whole, how like you were either meant to be a doctor,
engineer,
like, but So to talk to us about, like, I mean, that sort of was the difficulty between the relationship with your mom, because you weren't.
I wasn't like that.
Yeah,
and I was not allowed to technically embrace my individualism, and so we almost like how do you say, perpetuate the idea that we are cookie cutter, that we are the stereotypes that people talk about. But there's a reason for the stereotypes, obviously, and a lot of it comes from very sad places. So with regards to my parents, what they expected from me was that they really wanted me to at least like marry well, because that's kind of like they weren't sure that I would really make a success of myself as a creative, as a writer in South Africa, which is fairly true because I've never been offered a job based on my CV before. And the sorry, I forgot.
So, but maybe let's talk a bit about the relationship between your mom is different from the relationship between your sister. How is that relationship?
My sister and I, it was very strange because as children, like very young children, we played a lot together. And as we kind of developed into you have your own mindset, you have your own thing now. My sister was kind of that model minority. She was perfect in everything that she did. And I think that because she also had her foundation in Taiwan, and coming over here, we have this idea that my parents have, and first generation immigrants have this idea that they're guests. So we need to play up this model minority because we don't actually belong here.
Yeah.
Don't cause a fight. Don't cause a stir.
Yeah.
And being part of the younger generation, we slightly feel more entitled to being South African, and we proudly are proud of that because we have nothing from our country of origins, you know? And we speak about this deluded idea of this rainbow nation, but like we're never included in it anyway. So it's not exactly ideal. So my sister and I, our relationship is kind of rocky, but it also has developed over time where I started noticing things about my mental health that were profound to me because I never actually thought of myself having anxiety or depression. But after being diagnosed, a lot of things kind of made sense. And therapy, especially with a woman of color, a black woman, also allowed me to contextualize a lot of things and to understand them. So, and my group of friends as well, mostly black women, and all of them, I learned so much from them on a regular and daily basis that I feel so privileged, actually, to be embraced in that kind of space and to be allowed to learn. For my sister, because she is, how do you say, she went into the route of finance, she went into the route of, what is expected from our first generation immigrant parents. And I remember the time when she had this big rift with my dad, and that was because she did one thing against what they wanted. And that, I think, made her also realize how much that she had changed herself just to be this idea of a model minority. And we kind of slowly unlearn together as well.
And you speak about this really interesting idea. I had never discovered it before, but I read your book and I was like, okay. You speak about third
culture kid.
Yes. And I want to know, tell us about third culture kid.
So third culture kid is when your foundation of your culture is different to that of what's outside of you. So you're not really part of any culture necessarily, but you're kind of stuck in the middle. And so being Taiwanese, born in Taiwan, but with absolutely no memories of Taiwan, but being in South Africa, but seen as a foreigner, but in my own spaces, I'm seen as a banana, yellow on the outside, white on the inside, because what can you do but assimilate to survive, especially on the school playground as a child. There were a lot of things that I realized that I needed to unlearn about myself, because I became this idea of a pick-me girl, because I didn't want to be mocked for my culture, I didn't want to be bullied, I didn't want any of that. And the only way out of it, I thought, was to assimilate to what wouldn't receive that.
Wow. Like, let's speak about xenophobia.
Yes.
We're in this moment where a lot of the manifestations of xenophobia are anti-black.
Yes.
So the xenophobic violence is perpetuated towards African migrants in particular, or African asylum seekers and refugees. What are some of your experiences around xenophobia in this country, particularly in this moment as well, and as you've been navigating spaces?
It's been actually one of the most heartbreaking experiences. So 2 years ago, there was this news thing that hit, and it was about the donkey skinning. And with that, suddenly every single Chinese person in South Africa became targeted for hate speech. And it was so accepted. No one deleted these comments off social media. They kind of just like let it hang out there. They used racial slurs from America that we don't even use in South Africa, but to make sure that we knew that we didn't belong. And the problem with that is, again, the layers of yellow. When we talk about Chinese, and even so, the poachers, these people, the ones who actually are doing the offenses, it's not a mass group of people that represents an entire country.
And I suppose that's the other issue, right? It's just like, as minorities, and minorities in the sense of not numerical, but in terms of like culture.
Yes.
You are a representation of the whole.
Always.
Yeah.
Always. You're always seen as that. You're never seen as an individual. You're seen as the stereotype, the culture, the person from the culture. And the problem with that was no one saw it as racism. It was so okay to ridicule, to dehumanize the Chinese person in South Africa on social media. Like, we look at Penny Sparrow and what happened with her. You know what? I'm so fucking glad that happened to her. And I'm glad for every single person who's trialed and is charged for being racist. But no one seems to acknowledge that there's a lot of casual racism that occurs towards yellow people. And when I speak specifically about Chinese, because that is the only reference that people usually throw at us when they talk to us. Yeah. And that for me has just been so heartbreaking. Like, the other time I was attending Open Book Festival, and on way there we had a Zimbabwean Uber driver, and he was telling us this heartbreaking story about his 2 children that go to school, and they were told, like, recently throughout this xenophobic attacks that have been happening, that they need to go back to Zimbabwe. Little children telling other little children that they need to go back. Yeah. Yeah. And then it just took me back to being told to go back to China as a child. And you're so innocent in this kind of space. Your parents are trying hard for you to, to give you an education, to make sure that you're right. But other parents and other children don't make it okay for you. They don't, I don't know. And especially in South Africa, where we've historically, black people needed to seek asylum, elsewhere. Like, I don't understand how we don't see this in the same way when Africans from other countries come here.
It's just it really makes me angry, because I often think about it. I'm like, who taught us to hate ourselves?
Right.
Because that's what it is.
And pre-colonization, there were no borders, from what I understood.
Yeah. And so borders are colonial construct.
Exactly.
So we've perpetuated this colonial project by being like, oh, you are this, you are this, you are this. And only when it's convenient, because suddenly we're all African until we're not.
Yes.
And then we are South African, Malawian, but we are all African at some point until we're not.
But it shows how deep colonization has played in the terms of the systemic problems of society.
I wanted to talk a bit about, like, your feminist self. Obviously, because you grew up in a fairly conservative Taiwanese household, you became a rebel of sorts. You're like, actually, I don't like this. This doesn't sit well with me. And so those were the early signs of feminism. And what is your feminist ethic? So talk to us about, like, why you call yourself a feminist.
I feel that everyone should be a feminist, because feminism, to me, is about intersections. And there are many layers of feminism, and yes, each feminism movement had its time for what it was. But today, in the light of education, in the light of access to so much research, to so many brilliant people out there who study this kind of work, who are able to write for us and to give us context, intersections is the goal that we should all be trying to achieve. And therefore, falling short, it's okay if we fall short, but we need to acknowledge that we're not perfect in that sense, and not just keep defending ourselves in those kind of spaces. So to me, I am an unlearning feminist. I cannot claim to be the most woke. I cannot claim to be the most, to truly understand intersections, because I have got privilege, because I have been in spaces that, even so, like, if I had just, behaved and not speak my truth, I am very much accepted in white spaces. And I need to realize that in itself, yes, while it was harmful, is still a privilege, because it gave me access to a lot more than what others couldn't.
Trigger warning, I just want to talk a bit about like the hypersexualization
Yes.
of particularly when you think about Asian women as a
Yes.
whole, and some of the experiences that you've had around being hypersexualized and how that
Yes.
translated to sexual violation.
Yes.
Do you want to talk to us about that?
The first time I remember being sexualized was when I was 8 years old. And my dad, so when we came to South Africa, he had an acupuncture, he had a license to perform acupuncture. And so he did it as a side hustle, and whatever donation, he would ask for donations, and then we would send it to the Buddhist temple that we would send on Sundays. So there were always these big rugby Owens that would come to our house to get acupuncture because our family doctor would tell them to come to my dad.
Yeah.
And so I remember this one time, there was this couple, elderly white couple, and the wife immediately said to my dad, the husband immediately said to my dad, "Oh, your what's the name? Oh, I understand that Asians often take young wives."
So assuming that you
Were
are
his
your
wife.
dad's wife
Because I opened the door for them. Because as a dutiful child, I went to go open the door for them
at 8.
at 8. 8 years old. I did not have boobs then. So that was, I remember being the first time I was sexualized, and that made me really, truly uncomfortable because I did not understand how that was even a possibility. And then as I got older, it became it was simple things like, you would hear the casual, "Me love you long time, me so horny," and, all of these little phrases that get thrown at you, and people would talk about Asian women as submissive, as waiting for a white savior to come and take us away, and wanting to be dominated. We are then also, again, a stereotype. We are not individuals. Like, I could be completely asexual for yet I will be sexualized in a way because of how society has depicted us. When it comes to history and context of where this comes from, and it's understood that many Southeast and East Asian women were on the receiving end of needing to survive. And this is where sex workers became what they were, because it was just about trying to survive, trying to feed yourself, trying to feed a child, because all the men had gone to war. And it's really sick, honestly. And and like I said, as a teenager, I was slightly sheltered from all of this, and I went to all girls school as well, so that kind of aided that as well. But then in college, being around white men, so many white men for the first time, and I remember that we, in critical context, one of our courses that we had, we covered the topic of Orientalism. Every single person in the class literally turned around to look at me and giggled. And this is why I became the pick-me girl, because if I didn't laugh with, I am deemed then problematic, because I'm always the only East Asian in my circles.
Yeah. And you speak a lot about your mental health.
Yes.
Speak a lot about like how this mental health has impacted your life, right?
Yes.
And do you want to talk to us about, because I there's a minority stress
Yes.
that people talk about. It's just like the stress because you live in a minority, you live as a minority.
Yes.
And I wanted to speak about that, like your mental health, your journey with it, but also how are you coping with it now?
So remember I said earlier about the flight on the way here, and literally 2 kids were playing Ching Chong Cha. And when I explain in context of book that Ching Chong Cha doesn't mean anything, we actually literally say the words rock, paper, scissors. So 剪刀石头布. And so it's racist onomatopoeia. And for me, this happens so regularly and on a daily basis if I have to interact outside of my home. And the problem with that is every space then is triggering. Everything is a trigger. And I find myself, so I talk about like this acid buildup in my stomach that starts kind of churning things around. There's vultures that kind of flap their wings about inside there, and then I want to throw up. I feel sick, I feel nauseous. And that is due to my anxiety being pushed to its limits.
Yeah.
And the problem with that as an everyday occurrence is unfortunately, this is not going to go away. And so we need to find our own safe spaces. We need to find our own ways to cope, ways to deal, because there's no healing, absolute healing, that we would overcome something like this. This is something that's going to be with us till the day we die. And it might be even generational, where we will pass on the traumas to the next generation. So for me, I play with my dogs. They're pretty cool. And I read, I do, and obviously my sisterhoods and all of those kind of spaces where I'm validated if I do experience something, where my girls say to me, fuck that noise, like, you know who you are. And just to have that validation and that support and creating these sisterhoods where you allow that, it's been absolutely incredible. And I think that has helped me cope so much better with my mental health over the past couple of years.
There is also some joy in the book, which I want to talk about. But
Yes.
before we talk about the joy, there's also this expectation of East Asian families that you have to marry
Oh goodness, yes.
in the community.
Yes.
And I wanted to talk about that, like the idea that, like,
Oh,
you had to be a dutiful daughter who was going to find a dutiful East Asian man.
Oh,
and
no,
you're-
specifically Taiwanese, eh?
Yeah, and specifically Taiwanese.
Specifically Taiwanese.
And
Because-
how is wrestling that? Because I mean, I don't know, but like you're in Bloem, right? And then you come to Cape Town, like, because sometimes I think about, like, do you go out seeking, like, hello, are you Taiwanese? Okay, we can talk. If you're not, we can't.
I speak about the only two like East Asian people that I really knew in college, and there was the guy who was selling stuff at the store that I barely knew, and then my ex-boyfriend. And my ex-boyfriend, he was a very lovely guy. He was a very nice man, but at the same time, I don't really truly think we were even compatible. But hey, we were both Taiwanese, and we both had Taiwanese families, and we were the same age, and that was like kind of like
It just worked out.
It just worked out, Like, what more could I ask for? And then during college, I had these moments where I thought to myself, is this it? Is this truly it? Like, is this now my soulmate, my person that I will end up with? And I thought to myself, we're not even compatible. We don't like the same things. We don't find joy in the same things. And so when I decided to end our relationship, Shem, he did take it very hard, but I think over time, it developed into his own person. And that person, complete contrast to who I am today. So I'm very happy for him that he's found love and all of that. And I do feel very bad that we were almost an experiment for ourselves to figure out
what was going on.
So being able to find a good Taiwanese boy was basically impossible. And I said this often to my parents, like, why did you bring me to South Africa where we are such a tiny minority and expect me to find love within this tiny minority? And the thing is that it doesn't even talk about gender. It doesn't even talk about
sexuality.
Yes, sexuality and my preferences. And because I've been so conditioned to believe that I'm a cis woman, like that is all that I knew that I was. But then in college I started unpacking when I started meeting queer folk, and I was like, oh, I don't have to be this way. But I've been so conditioned to be a certain way that it's been really, really hard to really unpack that further. For me, race has been almost a bigger denominator in terms of my mental health and the problems that came with it, that I've kind of mostly focused on that in my unlearning and my development. And I sort of took a side step when it came to sexuality, because it's so hard to have to unpack almost every single aspect of your life when you realized how much you've been conditioned.
So, I mean, thinking about the hypersexualization and the relations that white men have to East Asian women, or more broadly Asian women.
Yes.
I want to know, like, people who read your book and discover for themselves that you are in an interracial relationship.
Yes.
Or maybe let's talk about just a normal day. You and your husband are walking around, nice. And then people actually realize that you're together. What happens?
Oh, I have to tell you this story. So we went to I think it was at the vet or something the one time, and like my husband and I, we're not very, we don't really do the PDA thing, so we don't even hold hands when we're public,
But do you think that the not holding hands is also conditioning?
Yes.
So you don't want to draw attention to yourself.
Yes.
So you sort of are like, we're not a PDA person, but it actually is, we're not because we don't want to draw attention.
It's a possibility, like subconsciously maybe. For me, I get sweaty, and also I do my own auditions, and I think he's also very similar when it comes to that. But I think we've been so conditioned to not want to draw attention to ourselves in general that it kind of maybe stayed with us. So on a subconscious level, that's a very big possibility. So I remember he was standing at the counter. No, I was standing at the counter and I was talking to the receptionist and I was talking about, oh no, my husband's got the, like papers or stuff that we needed to show them.
Yeah.
And then she said, oh, okay, no, your husband is right there. Because I was like, I don't know where my husband is. And she's like, oh no, your husband is right there. And she pointed at the other Asian man in the store. Yeah. That got awkward. And I just looked at her, I'm like, why do you think he's my husband? And she kind of had this like stunned look on her face. And I'm like, I don't know who he is. and she was so flabbergasted. She literally didn't say a word. And then when Carl came over, not being that Asian man, she didn't even apologize because she was, I think she was just in too much shock and so embarrassed that she had no words.
She made assumptions, right?
Yes, correct.
I really like reading about your love story. It was like, obviously now I'm giggling because I'm remembering.
Are you romantic at heart?
I am, so I was just like, ooh. But tell us about you and Carl.
Carl and I, there's a very deep foundation of friendship. And I think that was something that has been so vital in our relationship, to understanding each other and giving each other chances and being able to move forward together. Because I can't claim that I was this learned about unlearning when I met him. I've always been slightly progressive in the ways that I am because of just my personality in general. But I never had the context, I never had the terminology, I never knew how to explain what I had felt about racism and discrimination, consent, and all of these things that are so vital in a conversation today. But he, being someone who was bullied when he was a child, when he was in high school, because he was slightly overweight, and being a Soti, because even though he is Dutch, of Dutch descent, he's only second generation Dutch. Therefore, he doesn't speak Afrikaans like voortrekkers did. Yeah. And so I speak better Afrikaans than he does, so I can actually hold a conversation with his Oma, who only speaks Dutch. Yeah. And so he and I, there spent a lot of unlearning together. And a lot of the times I realized that when I was unlearning, I was in such an eager student that I wanted to make sure that he got all those lessons too, that he was unlearning with me. And this was something that my therapist actually helped me understand, and what that was, that we are all at different, we all have our own unique journeys and our own paths of unlearning. And for me, yes, even though he is white, I needed to see that he himself as an individual, and not always blanket this idea of whiteness, this concept that has been ingrained into me to dislike, to not want to be part of, and for him to be a progressive ally, that I was pushing him so hard, and I almost...
And often pushing him away, like,
yes,
in just like, Kyle, wake up, there's no time for you to feel this way.
Exactly.
Like, wake up. Was also pushing him away because, like,
yes,
it meant that Kyle had to become someone that he was not necessarily.
Not necessarily that it wasn't someone he wasn't that he didn't want to become. He wanted to become that person, but having been so heavily conditioned in the past, and as simple things, and he wasn't even, well, like I said, I will admit that I have racist conditioning, but I would never use racial slurs. Carl is the same. He didn't use racial slurs. He would never be racist towards a person. But until we learned what casual racism was, what systematic racism was, and this was a big unlearning journey for both of us. And I think that I pushed him too hard in so many spaces, but I completely would forget that he is still a white man at the end of the day. And with all that privilege of being a white man, it's harder to grasp these concepts than it is for
because
me.
he didn't need to, like the world revolves around white manness, right?
Yes.
So the fact that he didn't need to question it until, being in a relationship with you. But I loved what you said about like the fundamental friendship undertone. Because when I was reading the story, I was like, oh, they were friends, and then suddenly they realized, wait, maybe it's more than friendship.
Yeah.
And I really like that. I like that, like, in the midst of all this, there is some joy,
Yes.
And now you have a baby.
Yeah, we do. That's also a whole nother learning experience for us, realizing how mixed race babies are so fetishized. It's like we look at things and it's simple things like saying, oh my gosh, I love her eyes, and for me it's like, well, I understand that your intention is just to say she is cute and beautiful or whatnot, but that is basically saying that your full breed mom's Asian eyes actually, aren't that cool. They're not good enough. That's why you mixed into whiteness.
These ones.
Oh yeah, that is the eyes. Yeah. Those are the beautiful eyes.
Are you worried about your child growing up in this world?
I do. I honestly do. But what I am grateful for is the privilege that I've been granted to learn and unlearn, and that I will be able to give that to her. And so that she can have choices, that she can understand her mental health and understand how to navigate herself in a society that doesn't see her and then that also objectifies her.
I wanted to read this bit because I really it struck me. So this is almost like the last page of your book. You say, acknowledging your privilege requires deep self-reflection. No one can do this for you. You need to be willing to take a step back, realize it's not personal, and unpack it. And for me, that was deeply profound, right? The idea that you were saying, there are certain things that I have because of how I look, where I've been raised, what opportunities have been granted to me because of my positionality. But I'm also realizing that I have a privilege, and this privilege is self-reflection, Yes. And I mustn't think that it's personal when someone says, Ming, you're doing this, and it's coming across like this. It must be like, oh, actually, I've never actually realized that because I've never had to think in those terms, right?
Exactly.
And I think in some ways, for me, your book does a lot of call to action. Yes. I think it's important, your book is very important for me because, as I said, it's the often silent voices of migration.
Yeah.
We don't speak about how people had to leave entire countries and come and live here outside. It's not like a African to African in that sense. It's completely outside of the idea of, wow, we're leaving our continent. We're leaving Taiwan to
culture,
come to here. Yeah. And so that for me was really important because it was who's going to tell our stories if we don't tell our stories?
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. Who's going to know what has happened to me if I don't speak about it? And what is your hope for people reading the book? What do you hope people get out of the book?
I hope that people kind of embark on their own unlearning journeys, and also to not be to be self-critical, but at the same time to not be so hard on yourself when you do make mistakes. Because you know what, if Penny Sparrow had just said, I did this racist act, I've been so heavily conditioned to believe that it's okay that I say these things because I've been conditioned to be a racist. Do you know, honestly, I think that people would kind of not then make such a big deal about her case. It's just the fact that she denies. And that's a problem, is that if we keep denying that we are not in control of the way we are, then how do you move forward? Because coming from an advertising background, and I like what you said about the call to action, because as a copywriter, every message that you write needs to have a call to action. What is your call to action? What is the message that you are trying to achieve with this kind of work? For me, my objective is to help people acknowledge that privilege is not a scary word, to help people realize that racism is not a scary word, that we need to be able to unpack these things within our own groups, and also to acknowledge that if we do have privilege, if we are racist, that it's about unlearning it. Because you can't be a non-racist. You can only be anti-racist.
And that's an important distinction. I think that non-racialism creates the idea of color blindness. So we live in this rainbow nation where color doesn't matter. Where anti-racism really speaks about there are systems and structures in place that have privileged others over others. And for us to be anti-racist is for us to dismantle how racial superiority has privileged other people over others.
Yes. And so unless we actually acknowledge this, how can you have a friend of color? How can you have, it's just impossible actually, because there's no true depth in that friendship. If you can say that, you know what, I am friends with this black person, yet I live in such a privilege, and we never talk about race because, this black person is like my friend, and, we don't see race.
Exactly, we don't see color.
But if you speak to this black friend and you actually ask them, so tell me about your home, tell me about your parents, tell me about how you arrived to where you are. Do you know how that story would break you?
What is next for Ming?
Next for Ming, I want to keep writing. I'm really enjoying nonfiction and sharing stories, and I've so far had a decent reception to Yellow and Confused, and I kind of want to carry that on and kind of be less confused in the next book.
Maybe write a love story. Like, I feel like we're always so burdened as, again, minorities in a sense of cultural minority, and in that sense we're so like burdened with having to speak about the isms.
Yes.
So, but what about a love story? Because like I feel like there's really something there about you and Cal, and this could just be me as a hopeless romantic thinking. There's really something there about like the idea of friendship and how friendship can be a foundation for love, but also about tussling and about like the toing and froing when you are at a particular point and your partner is at a particular point. But also the idea of like having honest conversations about interracial relationships, because often I think that, because I always want to know about like the proximity to whiteness, like is that also some of the subconscious decision making that we make, right?
It's very possible. Yes.
So we're like, yes, love is love, but like, is it pointed a certain way because of the proximity?
Yeah. So it's been like quite a challenge for us as a couple, and especially now with the baby. But I know in the roots of his heart where he's at, and I know that he's actively unlearning and actively trying his hardest as a white man in the space that we are. And I cannot fault him for trying. I know, I can see it every single day. And he extends that into spaces like at work. He will call people out when they they do casual racism, because it's not always seen as racism. It's seen as, oh, that's just normal conversation. And the fact that he calls it out says something to me. Mm-hmm. And now, so the next, it could be like our love story in terms of how we learn to become parents, and with the child and everything. Because I have to say, like, pregnancy was such a bitch for me. I did not have a good pregnancy, and there was so many challenges during pregnancy that also tested our relationship as a couple. But like, knowing that I'm pregnant and harboring your spawn, this is this is something we need to work on, and we can't just let go. If we have a fight, we can't just let it go. We need to work on it. We need to unpack it and figure out how to move forward from there. And I think that there were a lot of lessons that were learned in this process, and also how romanticized pregnancy is in media, that I kind of also want to shed some light about how...
Yeah, like, actually it wasn't that hunky-dory.
No, it wasn't. I was nauseous for 8 whole months because I had to give birth early because of a liver condition. Yeah, it's just... And to my point, this whole book was basically written during my pregnancy. So it started, I had already actually received a contract before I'd fallen pregnant, and then I was editing in hospital as I came out of my C-section.
Oh, wow.
And it was important for me to meet deadlines, and especially to respect my publisher, who has given me so much support.
I mean, we're coming to the fun part of the Cheeky Natives podcast, giving away land. I think as part of reclamation, like, to just give you a farm in Bloemfontein for you to plant roots there and be like, I'm here and I'm here to stay. So from the Cheeky Natives, we are giving you a farm in Bloemfontein. And the whole idea is just basically to be like, for all intents and purposes, you were someone who was raised in Bloemfontein.
Yes.
So when people are like, oh, tell us about where you're from, you're like, Bloem? Because that's where you were raised, right?
Yes.
So that sort of reclamation about the fact that, like,
I do have land there, so this is I am from Bloem.
But Ming, honestly, thank you very much for extending an invitation to be in conversation with the Cheeky Natives about this book.
I'm so honored to have you guys share my story.
I think that it's really important. Thank you for also writing. I think oftentimes we don't realize like how deeply vulnerable and personal this type of writing is, because you really have to revisit painful moments in your life, right, in order for you to give an authentic story. So thank you for extending yourself in the way that you have. we hope that more will come from you, and that you, hopefully, at some time, you won't have to write about the isms, and you'll have to write
lovely.
about
Just like happy food.
Yeah,
you
like-
know? Yeah, my love relationship with food.
Before we go, I want to talk about the restaurant in Melville.
Oh, damn that restaurant. Damn you, me so horny. So yes, this restaurant. My like.
Because I actually remember your tweet. I actually remember your tweet.
So this was hectic because I just saw on Facebook someone had shared this page of this new restaurant in Melville, Johannesburg, and it was titled Me So Horny, and I'm like, no, this cannot be. It must be a joke. Clicked on it. It was a real restaurant, and it was opening. Like right then, it was doing an opening.
Mm-hmm.
And then I searched for this restaurant on Google, and I found that there was an article about it on the Eat Out website. And for me, this was a complete betrayal by the food media industry, especially one that I've been working so hard at in terms of educating about cultural appropriation and the lack of representation in food media. That it's, I still can't believe that from creative to come up with a name to the person who printed all of these and put them up on the walls, I don't understand how no one in that process thought Me So Horny would not be problematic.
I suppose it's also the idea that nobody actually
Would
cared.
say something. Yes, no one.
So they're
cared.
like, oh, okay, yeah, this can make a few buzzwords.
And for me, it's having to actually give people the context of where Me So Horny came from, why it's problematic, and how it hurts East and Southeast Asian women on a regular basis.
I mean, there was a lot of backlash that you also experienced because of
I was
of what?
trolled
Yeah.
heavily.
Yeah.
I was called cunt. I was called it was just so many. I was called chink and gook and all these words that honestly I'd actually not even heard of because they're American slurs for
yeah.
Chinese people.
Yeah.
And to experience this in South Africa, because now remember my tweet went viral because Black Twitter, rah Black Twitter, I love you guys, like really took it to the next level, and then the diaspora Asians from around the world, and it was just so incredible the support that we got from minorities, from others, from cultures that are often appropriated, to be able to be validated in this journey to fight this together. Because this wasn't my fight. I didn't want to fight it, but if I didn't tweet that, would anyone have actually known the problematic behavior behind that, and how maybe someone will just see, oh no, that's really shitty, I hate that, and just not go into it. But that kind of name should not exist
In the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so my tweet went viral, and there was so much trolling that happened, and I just landed up blocking people and stuff. But then someone kind of went next level and emailed me to threaten me and to tell me that they will pay money to watch me get punished. And that for me was a whole nother level of, it actually really scared me, because now I'm just thinking about, what if they find out my address, in some way, and then throw poison over the wall to my dogs, or do something that, like, my mind went to really dark places. And so I kind of went to every single account I had. I removed all my physical addresses to a PO box address. I did so much back end work to change things, because my blog got hacked.
Yes.
And it got hacked. I lost a lot of content, and my friends who helped me fix it, every single developer actually said to them that this was a professional hack. Someone actually got paid to hack into my blog, my happy little food blog. Really?
But also to speak about, like, the audacity, right?
Yeah.
The
entitlement
Yeah.
to need to be the one to punish.
Yeah.
That for me was just screamed like this misogynistic idea of patriarchy, that you are the savior. You will now save these restaurant owners from this little Asian woman who wants to fight you. Oh, how dangerous I am.
Again, Ming, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's been a
having me.
really wonderful conversation. We wish you all the best from the Cheeky Natives, and we hope that next time with other books, we'll be able to have conversations with you. Until next time, Cheeky Natives, bye.